Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. This is part 3 of the Theodore Robert Bundy series. If you haven't seen parts 1 and 2, this is the time to stop, push pause, and we'll be right back here when you've watched those 2 parts. Here's the copyright disclaimer and the trigger warning. These true crime videos, especially this series, they're not made for children, and this series in particular contains sensitive subject matter. Viewer discretion is advised. So let's get into it.
Have you ever physically harmed anyone?
Ever physically harmed anyone? No. No. You know, again, not in the context I think that you're speaking of. No man is truly innocent. I mean, we all have transgressed in some way in our lives, and as I say, I've been impolite, and there are things I regret having done in my life, but nothing like the things I think that you're referring to.
That footage was from when Ted was still proclaiming his innocence. Later on, he will go on to make many confessions, but right now we're talking about 1973 and into 1974. Also note that in 1973, Ted bought his brown 1968 VW Bug, and that was what he was tooling around in when he wasn't using somebody else's car. So it's summer of 1973, and Ted, while on a business trip to California, had a re-hookup with his girlfriend, Diane. And we'll get back into how they became engaged at Christmas, but basically, Ted was able to compartmentalize all his girlfriends, just like he was able to later compartmentalize his killings. Ted wanted to go to law school, and he'd taken the LSATs and received low scores on them, but he had good letters of recommendation. So he applied to 10 law schools, and he received 1 acceptance from the University of Utah. But he initially declines this because he was thinking he would get better offers. He ends up lying to the University of Utah and telling them that he was injured and couldn't attend. In September of 1973, he attends the law school at the University of Puget Sound. That was founded in 1972. This is 1973. So he's not sure of the future and the fate of the law school program at his old alma mater. So he's attending classes from 3 p.m. to 10:45 on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. And he does this for a year when he does go. Then he will go on to the University of Utah for a year. So he found the law school at University of Puget Sound to be déclassé. His grades suffered due to his peeping and his voyeurism. You know, he'd be out there trolling the streets of Tacoma, peeping in the windows, and worse. I mean, how do you think you're going to do well in law school? Patty Adams saw Ted around this time, and she teased him about his new clothes, his new girlfriend, and a beard. Quote, "I teased him, and he said he was trying to change his image by trying not to be a college type," end quote. Christmas 1973, Ted spends his holidays with Diane. They get engaged, and then he ghosts her. You know, basically, in my opinion, he got what he wanted, and then he didn't want her anymore. And this is another method of control. Ted will later say that he was, quote, "trying to demonstrate to myself that I could have married her," end quote. And this is when Ted decides to reapply to the University of Utah. But keep in mind, that's just reapplying. He's not leaving Washington yet. In fact, he's going to go on a spree. By New Year's, he was attacking his next victim. He also happily returned to Liz, who he realized was his stability with her domesticity and her family life. How before the killings, Ted made abortive attempts, and that once he began to kill, it escalated. And Ted will later speak about the entity. But he claimed he was not angry most of the time, but it was more of an adventuristic arousal, and that he would hear a voice, but it was not a schizophrenic symptom. In my opinion, it was more like a bad conscience, you know, like something on your shoulder going, "Hey, do this," you know. It was more in his mind. And he viewed the women as quarry or symbols of the quote-unquote idealized woman, which he wanted to possess. Just to be super clear here, Ted had a degree in psychology. So he knew the difference between schizophrenia and just being bad, doing things he knew he shouldn't be doing. He knew that those weren't real voices he was hearing, it was more like an urge. Let's talk about Bundy's idealized woman. The Washington victims were almost all the same age range. They were all attractive. They were college girls, Caucasian, petite, with dark hair. They always go on and on about parted in the middle. That was the style at the time. And just note, petite girls are also easier to snatch. And just another note, I haven't noticed a lot of people mention this, but almost all the girls had light color eyes and dark hair, which is a more rare genetic trait to have, like, say, blue eyes and dark hair. A lot of his victims had either blue eyes or hazel eyes or light color eyes, not necessarily chocolate brown. Also note for the record that Bundy and Diane had broken up only 3 days prior to the attack on his next victim. Ted likely struck close to home for his first victims, trolling in his comfort zone, in my opinion. Ted went on to tell 4 different stories about his first victim. He told Polly Nelson one story, he told Art Norman another story, he told Keppel a third story, and Hagemeyer a fourth story. The consensus of opinion at this point is that Ted's first victim may have been a hitchhiker from Tumwater in May of 1973. He later confessed to this, but I don't think they've identified the victim yet. This information is from the FBI's Ted timeline they created. So it's January 4th. He was in Seattle on the 3rd buying gas, so he was in town, and he's broken up with Diane. He's gotten the best of her. It's January 4th, and there's Karen Sparks Epley, also known in the different Bundy books as Mary Adams. She's now come forward with her story. She's a poli-sci major who was living in the basement bedroom at 4325 8th Avenue Northeast in Seattle. She lived only 6 blocks from Bundy. That was a mere 5-minute walk. As she had frequented Dante's Tavern, it's possible that Ted had seen her there on a previous occasion and stalked her. This picture of the house is from oddstops.com, which I highly recommend. This was a brazen attack as she lived with 3 men. So Ted sat outside her apartment and she was watching TV upstairs, and she slept in the basement. Then she came downstairs and fell asleep at 2. And he waited until she fell asleep to sneak inside. And her roommates assumed that she was sleeping late the next day. But she had been beaten while she was asleep, and she was attacked with a piece of the bed frame from her bed. And if you look at the crime scene photos, the bed is on the floor. So people had said it was a piece of metal rebar from the yard, but she said it was from the bed frame. Maybe the bed wasn't put together. So he's beaten her while she's asleep with this piece of metal. He's violated her with the metal. And she believes that since her roommate talked in his sleep, she believes that he began to talk, and that spooked Ted. And she was found late the next afternoon. She was in a coma, but she survived. This is Karen today. She survived, but she had 50% partial hearing loss, a ringing in her ears, 40% partial loss of her sight, and some brain damage. Her bladder had also been split, and when she came to in the hospital with no memory of the attack, which was a blessing for her, she asked her father, Dad, what happened? And he replied, well, you had a little bump on your head. So she was able to recover without a lot of the memories, with no memories of the attack. She's now come forward using her real name, and she is doing well. Bless her heart. Ted will be in the vicinity of every victim mentioned in this series, and when I have the data, I will show it from the FBI's timeline. It's January 31st, 1974, less than a month from the attack on Karen Sparks. And Bundy is writing a check at the Safeway store at 49th and Brooklyn, very close to the Healey residence. And this is Linda Ann Healey, age 21. I also want to mention that I've seen her name spelled with a Y and with an I on her grave. It is spelled with an I. Also in the FBI's files, it's spelled with an I, but it's spelled two different ways. You're going to see a commonality about these girls, and it's not just the exterior of them being quote-unquote Ted's idealized victim. They're good people. They're the type of girls that would help you out. They're compassionate. Linda Ann Healey tutored kids, and she worked part-time at a Seattle radio station giving the ski report. And she majored in psychology at the University of Washington. It's also believed that maybe she even had a class or two with Ted. Linda was 5'7", 115 pounds, with long brown hair and blue eyes. She enjoyed singing, and she lived in a 2-story University of Washington basement house in the University District, a few blocks west of Liz. Again, with the basements, Karen Sparks attacked in a basement. Linda Healey attacked and abducted from a basement. Ted Bundy, his childhood was spent in the basement. Linda had really decorated the old basement with the 1970s decor of the time. She just went crazy renovating this old basement to make it homey for her and her roommate. It's also believed that she frequented Dante's Tavern. Ted's girlfriend Liz Klepfer will later testify or later tell investigators that Ted also frequented Dante's, O'Banion's, which were next to each other, as well as the Pipeline Tavern. And when Ted was in his predator phase, he liked to observe his victims. He liked to invade their spaces. Linda had 4 roommates, and the previous night it was her turn to make dinner, so she had made what she called company casserole for her roommates. And she was last seen at approximately 10 p.m., and there were 2 bedrooms in that basement, and she just simply vanished from that bedroom basement in the middle of the night. She worked for Western Ski Promotions doing the ski forecast for radio station KVI, and her morning alarm was going off at 5:30, and she failed to come into work on the 1st of February. So her roommate, after getting a call from work, went to check on her. She found the bed made, and the side door was unlocked. After a while, the roommates contacted Linda's mother and then the police. And then they went back down into the basement, and pulling back the covering, there was blood on the pillow, blood on the mattress, and blood smeared on the back neck of her nightgown, which had been hung back up in the closet. When the bed was made, it was made with hospital corners, which Linda did not do. The top sheet was missing because Ted had wrapped Linda in it. One police detective asked if she had had nosebleeds, but that was way too much blood for a nosebleed. There was also semen located on the bottom sheet, but remember, back then, we didn't have DNA testing. Using the third person, Ted will later essentially go on to confess to her abduction and murder. And he said that the entity would have seen the house and its occupants before. He posited that she had been strangled in her bed and then rendered unconscious. Obviously, by the look of the blood, there was probably some blunt force trauma, as striking his victims becomes his MO. The suspect, Ted, would make her bed and take her out the front steps and to his vehicle. She would be taken to a remote location, untied, and then he would abuse her for a few hours and then murder her. He said her body wasn't buried. He also implied that she died on Taylor Mountain, so one would think that those wounds were not fatal if he was telling the truth. He also said that the suspect, that he was talking about in third person himself basically, would watch the newspapers and the ensuing investigation, and he said that the guilt and the remorse was in not getting caught. So hoping not to get caught. Many times he would remove the victim's clothing, their jewelry, and other personal effects in order to make the victims harder to identify if they were ever found. He also will go on in other cases to talk about cutting their clothing into little 3-inch strips. Sadly, both Karen and Linda are just the first two in a long reign of terror that he will bring down upon Washington before he makes off to Utah. So, if you found this informative, please hit the like button. Please hit the subscribe bell. We'll go into part 4 and look into some of the other girls. These were nice girls that had full lives and would have been productive members of society. They were loved. They had families. There's all kinds of victims that this guy left in his trail. So what can we learn from this guy? What can we learn to protect ourselves? What can we learn to not? To recognize people like him, please subscribe for part 4.